If you told me about Godard's King Lear adaptation, I'm not sure I would believe you, partly because this is one of the strangest adaptations ever made, but also partly because I would have thought that I'd already seen it, already knew all about it. I mean, Jean-Luc Godard, he made a movie with Woody Allen and nobody has heard of it. How could that be? One of the reasons is that it's pretty hard to find a copy. A few people have uploaded the movie to YouTube, but the quality is almost unwatchable, and strangely, these videos are not the same length. There's a decent DVD release as well, that's what I watched, but really nobody has a great copy of this movie, at least not for a few more weeks, when Criterion releases King Lear on Blu-ray, which seems like it's great news, but in a way, I think it's kind of a bad thing, partly because this movie is not very good, and that is not an accusation I make lightly. I'll talk about it a lot more, but yeah, this one's a bit of a dud for me, I think. There's also another slightly more subtle reason why I'm maybe not looking forward to the movie being released more widely. I can't really explain that, though, without talking about the movie first, which, hey, that's what we're here to do, isn't it? King Lear is kind of intimidating. There's a lot to Godard, and there's a lot to Shakespeare, and there's some to Woody Allen, too. This may be a long-ish video, we'll see. Before we go any further, let me tell you about the rest of the cast. This movie stars absolutely nobody, if you look at the credits, because no actors are credited whatsoever. We'll talk about the credits a lot more in a second. Godard, of course, yet again, opts to use them to defy expectations and confound rather than to tell you who's in the movie or what it's called. First, though, it's my duty to tell you that Woody Allen is only in the movie for about 1 minute, and it's 1 minute right at the end. If you see Woody Allen's name come first in regards to this movie, it's because of something called the alphabet. Next in the dictionary is Freddie Bouache, a Swiss film historian, the first of many actors in the film who are not actors, and incidentally, who aren't that great at acting. Leos Carax, also not an actor, is also in the movie. I have a video about his film Annette. He is one of my favorite directors who is still alive, and one of my favorite directors of all time, in fact. Oh, I have a video, too, about his movie Holy Motors, which was a life-changing film for me, believe it or not. A very young Julie Delpy is in the movie. Of course, Leos Carax had just directed Julie Delpy in Bad Blood, a very, very cool movie. Godard appears both as himself and as an odd character named Dr. Pluggy. Well, I guess you hear his voice as himself, and you see him as Dr. Pluggy, a thinly veiled version of himself. People talk a lot about self-reference with Godard, but maybe another term would be self-interest or self-centeredness or something like that. Question for the floor. Godard has a slightly strange accent in this movie, which is not what you will hear if you listen to him speaking English in interviews from the same time he speaks English in this movie. This movie is in English. But yeah, it doesn't seem like his normal English accent. It almost sounds like he's attempting a Michael Caine impression, which I'm not sure was a very good idea. He probably sounds a lot cooler when he's speaking French. I'll skip a few people. Here, the cast is rounded out by Norman Mailer and his daughter, Kate Mailer. Burgess Meredith is there. Molly Ringwald. Molly Ringwald is in this movie. And Peter Sellers, but that's Sellers with an A, because Sellers with an E was not alive at the time. Sellers with an A probably has the most screen time out of anyone that I've mentioned here, and that's despite being probably the least well known, although Sellers is highly regarded in some circles as a theatrical provocateur, the kind of rebel that could only come from Phillips Andover and then Harvard. This movie, like I said, it's in English. I think it was Godard's first film in English. Maybe Godard working in English was another thing that could have held back some of the acting in the film. Of course, in some ways, acting isn't really relevant for this movie, but in other ways, it's pretty bad. Ostensibly, King Lear is an adaptation of, you guessed it, King Lear, but unsurprisingly, it isn't really. We'd be disappointed if Godard had given us something straightforward, I suppose. The story follows William Shakespeare Jr., the fifth, that's Peter Sellers, in a post-apocalyptic world, after Chernobyl, where culture has been destroyed. There's plenty of buildings that seem totally unaffected by the disaster. Reminds you a little bit of something like Alphaville, a movie set in the distant future that looks strangely like right now, the playful futurism of Godard, while here we have the playful post-apocalyptic world of Godard, where all the libraries are intact, but all the culture, all the works are destroyed, it would seem. And the task falls to William Shakespeare Jr. the Fifth to resurrect this, to recreate all of these classics. That's the plot, but you only spend a few minutes on the plot in this movie. More generally, I guess this is a story about an encounter between our decaying world of today and the decaying world of yesterday, the classics. It's a story about creative processes, definitely. Those things are also the story of Contempt, by the way, a much, much better movie. Contempt is another film with a slightly unexpected neoclassical strain to it. Godard does take a couple of themes from King Lear, the play. The two most explicit ones are virtue versus power. This is a fairly clear idea in the play. It was probably something Godard thought about a lot, maybe when he struggled to get money for his movies, for instance. And virtue versus power, well, that's in the news today as well. We also get the idea of nothing or no thing, two words. This also comes out of the play when Cordelia is asked to praise her father in order to get her slice of the inheritance. What does she say? She says nothing. So nothing is something that you can say. It's a thing and it's not a thing. Godard keys into the thingness of nothing and plays with this nothing versus no thing throughout the film. In some ways, this is a fairly elementary philosophical idea, but there's something here, I suppose. If you're looking for a faithful adaptation of King Lear, obviously this is not it. That's probably not what anybody was expecting out of Godard. Maybe you wonder if he could have engaged with more of the themes of the play. It kind of seems like he only read the first act and then got a bit distracted and started talking about images and his other favorite subjects. We'll come back to some of these ideas, but let's talk about the style first. In some ways, Godard has never made movies. He's never made movies. His work has always lived on the boundary of what people thought movies were. Today, if you watch Breathless or Contempt, that might not be as obvious because those movies are so influential. Godard's early films were so big that some of his subversive tricks would eventually become mainstream. They'd sort of travel by osmosis throughout the world of cinema. His jump cuts, dismemberment, jumpy soundtracks, weird credits, all these hallmarks would make their way into Hollywood movies and then into television and then into kids' television. These things may never, kids' television is not going to be as radical as the real thing, as the new wave or whatever, but the grammar has just become more and more familiar. And even if it's not used as jarringly, even if it's like relegated to it's the dream sequence, better throw in some weird stuff, still people are just way more familiar with that, right? So maybe these old films don't feel as wacky. Well, some of them maybe, but don't worry, Godard was just getting warmed up in the 60s and 70s, and while the new wave sort of petered out, you might say, he kept making radical movies, and he kept doing that into the 2010s. I say thankfully he kept doing this, but even the staunchest Godard fan has to admit that none of his later films really had the same reception or the same influence as his early work. You could make a case for the history of cinema, I suppose. We'll assess Godard's later work in a second, but first, let me tell you about some of the strange things he does in this movie, some of the kooky tricks he pulls to undermine cinematic norms. I mentioned already that we have weird opening credits. At one point, Godard was satisfied just by making opening credits with very bright colors. Here he does something more extreme. What's the purpose of a film's credits? Well, I said already, they tell you who's in the movie and what it's called, at the very least, hopefully. We don't get either of those things in this movie, and there's no credits at the end either. Usually, the credits, they'll at least give you the name, but not so much. The film starts out with a number of different titles. Actually, the very beginning of the film, is a recording of a phone conversation between Godard and the film's producer, and the producer is explaining that he's worried. It doesn't seem like they're on track. Everybody keeps asking him what's happening with the movie. He tells Godard, hey man, we have to have this thing ready in time for Cannes. Then one of the other people on the call says, well, what's your response to that, Jean-Luc? And Godard says, action. And the movie starts. Hey, that's pretty good. That's a good start, right? And this is where the first of the titles come in, and they introduce the movie as King Lear, Fear and Loathing, but also as King Lear, A Study, and as King Lear, An Approach, and as King Lear, A Clearing. Get used to these titles because they're going to keep popping up for the entire movie. We'll come back. It's funny. One thing I remember thinking about when I was earlier on in my film life, I thought, man, it's so cool when the opening credits of a movie come late on. if you start the movie with the opening credits, that's so lame. You missed an opportunity for the main guy to say something cool and then show the opening credits or whatever. This isn't as important to me now, but there are some movies out there that really wait a long time. The two probably that come to mind, The Departed, I think. It's like you're watching the movie, you're totally into it, and then they show the opening credits, and you're like, what? Like, it started. It's too late. But is there anything, and I mean, this is probably an answerable question. To me, I can't think of something with opening credits that come in later than Love Exposure by Sion Sono. Really interesting movie. But that, you go like 40 minutes into the movie before they show the opening credits. Anyway, we'll come back to some of these ideas that come up in the credits in a second. But the next piece of style here that's going to hit you in the face is probably going to be the audio. Hits you in the side of the face, right around here. There are very few scenes in this movie where you hear someone talking and also see them talking. Usually, the images and the sound aren't really connected. And the movie's it's sort of like we are watching a movie with director's commentary turned on, right? We see the first scene after these credits I mentioned, and, well, after. And then we also hear Godard commenting on the first scene as we're watching the first scene, talking about working with Norman Mailer, things like that. And then, guess what happens? We see the first scene again, and he comments some more. So repetition, another subversive move, and this will happen a couple more times in the movie. Soon, we're going to hear the voices of other characters. Probably the most jarring thing is that two voiceovers will often overlap. This is, one of the most aggressive techniques in the movie, and for me at least, it's hard to follow both threads when they happen together, when two people are talking over each other. It's interesting. One of the most basic ideas of movies, I guess, is that you see people talking, you listen to what they're saying, you can hear them, you can understand them. That's not really the case in this movie, and it really destabilizes a lot of what's being said, and some of the intellectual structures or ideological structures in the movie are really kind of swirled around by this technique. When Godard is speaking in the movie, you might think, well, this is important. It's Godard. Let's take notes. But then he'll drown out his own voice with something else. There's an interesting dynamic across almost all of Godard's films where you might think that you need to read everything very closely. And maybe that is fruitful in some cases. I mean, there's a lot of trivia you can find in this movie. There's a lot of little artifacts you can pick out, a lot of things you can look at if you're a big fan. But Godard also has an impatience and a playfulness and a lightness to him that will confound you if you study it too closely, and the audio here really speaks to this. We often hear sections from King Lear in like the voiceover or whatever, and if you're an overachiever, you think, okay, better pay attention here. It's King Lear. It's the play. This is the stuff, right? But then the lines get cut off or drowned out, and you think, well, should we be paying attention to that? In modern terms, Godard was always a bit of a troll, and I like this, but it can feel slightly unrigorous at times. There's a balance of art and ideology in a lot of these movies that can be hard to grapple with sometimes. There are some other interesting tricks with the sound, like prominent animal noises. The score is made up of classical pieces, but they're often sped up or slowed down. This follows from a lot of other Godard films, where a big orchestra suddenly is silenced in a way that shatters some cinematic illusion or whatever. In King Lear, you can hear the tape ramping up or slowing down. The score is probably one of my favorite parts of the movie. It sounds cool, and these tape ramps are cool. And again, shattering some kind of illusion. We have a ton of inserts of visual art in the movie, paintings mostly. There's some cool stuff in here. You might be really tempted to track down what all these things are and really look into it. We see some characters looking through a big coffee table book full of paintings a couple times in the movie, just like the one you find in Contempt. And it makes you think that Godard probably spent a lot of time in his life with that kind of book. Anyway, you probably get the idea. This is a radical movie in some ways. It doesn't feel like a Shakespeare adaptation, and it doesn't really feel like a movie, in fact. It reminds me maybe more of a documentary or something, or like a director's commentary, like I said. Its closest neighbors are probably other Godard films, like Contempt and The History of Cinema. In some ways, I'd say this is a fusion of those two things. There is a lot of playful trickery in this movie, which is cool. Now, if Godard became more and more radical as his career went on, does that mean that his movies got better and better? Well, I haven't seen a lot of his later work, so I will only comment on this one. King Lear is, in some sense, more radical than something like Contempt, but it's hard to make a case that it's better. If you're really into Godard's ideology, you might appreciate his later movies more. You might sense some kind of evolution or something like that. But I think the jury has largely come back on these movies, to be honest, where one of them is extremely well known and widely admired, and the other one not so much. If we're talking about Contempt versus King Lear, the jury's come back. And yes, Godard is meant to confound and confuse, so maybe judging his films based on the reaction of the viewing public doesn't make much sense. Some people will talk about Godard as if when more people dislike the movie, the more radical and the better it must be. But let's get real. Godard's early films were also meant to confound, and people like them. This movie came out almost 40 years ago, and doesn't really seem like the opinion is shifting, or will. I'm curious what people will make of King Lear when it comes out on Blu-ray. Some people, I'm sure, will excavate, but I don't know. Richard Brody, he defends the movie, but maybe not always the guy that you want on your side. This movie is great for gatekeeping, though. So look, we'll see. I think there are three big differences between King Lear and Contempt, or maybe between earlier Godard films and later ones, but I'm not going to generalize too much here. First of all, this movie kind of feels like more of the same. Yes, it's more extreme, and it is playful and has some clever pieces, but at a high level, it's kind of exactly what you would expect from Godard. Sort of in a good way, if you're a fan, but also kind of in a predictable way, which is not probably what he was shooting for. Suddenly, that doesn't sound quite as radical. More of the same, yes, more extreme, but, do it kind of the same old ideas, just turned up another notch or something. Another crucial difference is that this movie did not have any emotional salience for me. I have a video about Contempt where I talk about how that movie changed my life. I'm not exaggerating. I don't know how it did it, but I know it did. And not because of anything ideological, because of its feelings. And maybe because of its pictures, but because of its feelings. This movie is not emotionally dynamic. There's a little bit of a sense of loss at times. Oh, Chernobyl, the world was destroyed, right? We lost all of our culture. A little strife between father and daughter. A feeling of loneliness in William Shakespeare Jr. V that he's trying to set out to rediscover this stuff. And there is some talk of death at the end. So there are hints of emotion, but this is mainly a dusty and distant movie that, like I said, had almost literally zero emotional salience for me, which is the polar opposite of some of Godard's other films. And I'm not saying these things should be melodramatic, but there are clear differences between something like this and something like Contempt in how they focus on, people's actual lives or whatever. So both of these things are pretty significant. Feels like more of the same. It's not emotional, but I think those pale in comparison to the next thing. If there's one single factor that explains Godard's lack of success later in his career, brace yourself for this, it's that his movies weren't as cool. Now that might grind some people's gears. Surely Godard is about more than being cool. I think he absolutely is, but you're fooling yourself if you think that isn't part of what draws people to him and his movies. And even for the most pretentious viewers, I think the coolness still glues his movies together, but not this one. I can't really defend this claim that the movie isn't cool, but it ain't. I'm pretty sure, okay? Having said all this, there are parts of the movie that I like. I think King Lear is not without virtue, especially if you're a big Godard fan. There's a scene relatively early on in the film, for instance, when you are still trying to figure out exactly what kind of game we're playing, what we're watching, where, in this scene, William Shakespeare Jr. V goes to a restaurant, and he's sitting at a table with a bowl of soup, and the main thing you hear is the sound of him slurping his soup. This is a great Godard move. You sit and you listen to the guy slurp for a bit, and it kind of seems like you might cut away or do something else, but you don't really. You are also, though, you begin to kind of overhear the conversation at the table next to him, which is between a father and his daughter. A father who demands attention, admiration, and a daughter who's not totally on board with that. In other words, it's King Lear. Right? We see a lot of fairly puzzling creative processes in this movie, a window into the creative life. TCL, the creative life, I believe is what that stands for. This moment of inspiration from the next table is clever, rediscovering Shakespeare in the conversation next to you. That's kind of clever. I like this idea in general of William Shakespeare Jr. V. The acting is a bit iffy, Again, maybe the acting doesn't matter too much in a movie like this, but still, I think it holds the movie back. I'm realizing, am I not in the middle of the frame here? Hope that's not too annoying. Let's go over here a little bit. Okay. I like the idea of trying to recreate Shakespeare after the apocalypse. Being on this kind of mission. They talk about Chernobyl here, and it was pretty common to associate nuclear disaster with cultural catastrophe. Given the technology we have now, that seems sort of quaint. Godard didn't quite make it to the ChatGPT era. I don't know what he would have thought of that, what would he have thought about images created by stable diffusion, pictures of nothing, truly authorless texts? Well, nuclear catastrophe will have to do for his era rather than AI catastrophe. In King Lear, this nuclear catastrophe, the tendrils of postmodernism, they trigger a call for resurrection. And that's interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not sure you would be able to pinpoint the plot of this movie or really have any idea what was going on if William Shakespeare Jr. V didn't tell the audience fairly directly. Godard says a lot about images. He says that words are reckless, that they fall way short, and yet there's a lot of verbal exposition here, and without it, you might be pretty lost. It's also a movie about trying to recapture the words, the words of Shakespeare. Now, I'm not saying Godard's wrong here or whatever, like, oh, he likes images, but he talks about words. What? That doesn't make any sense. No. More so, words versus images, language versus images. That's a central theme of the movie and would also be of some of his even later films as well. To me, this angle, I don't know, it didn't feel very incisive. And the whole images subplot is a little bit shoehorned into the story of King Lear. I don't know. One reason maybe is that the cinematography in this movie, the images themselves, are a bit underwhelming. Some of the inserts are nice, but the things they actually shot for the movie are not particularly remarkable. This search for images maybe hits its peak towards the end of the movie in conjunction with a shot of a horse running along a beach. That's the most pure image they can come up with. Is Godard being sarcastic here? Or, is this what they really thought, like, purity was? Because, I don't know. Bit of a cliche. Blade Runner, of course, was already out at this point. And there, the horse had an extra one of these. So, I don't know. It's a little hard to lodge a specific complaint with this axis of the movie because it's pretty vague. Maybe some big Godard fans will be way more keyed into this than me, but it didn't quite do it. Like I said, though, we don't need to be too mathematical about this, I suppose. In some ways, this movie operates at the second order. For instance, we have a scene with Norman Mailer and his daughter. Apparently, he was supposed to be in more of the movie, but had a falling out with Godard and left after one day. In the first scene, which we see twice, we see him working on the screenplay for the movie. He talks to his daughter about it a little bit, and he says, I think the only way to do King Lear is with gangsters. So is this movie making the case that gangsters are the kings of America? That's the only slice of society that has the same, really dramatic life and death mechanics, where the only place where you find Shakespearean tragedy would be in the mafia? Or is the movie saying that some people might think that that's the case? Well, we do get a gangster subplot throughout the movie with Burgess Meredith playing Don Liaro. This is another place where virtue versus power comes into play. They tell the story, for instance, of a gangster who is very principled or whatever. It's pretty clear that Godard doesn't know much about gangsters and that he doesn't know much about America. This might be an issue if you were trying to make a movie about those things, but this subplot is probably about something else, like the sort of cultural exchanges that are made between France, England, and the United States, the kind of exchanges you make when you talk about King Lear. Those were relationships that Godard was fascinated with for large parts of his career. I don't know. Godard's encounter with America is kind of interesting. He seems a bit like a tourist in some sense. It's interesting. I'm running out of steam here a little bit, but let me just reiterate that, like I said, a lot of the things going on here are, I guess to put it most simply, more about provocation than any specific incisive claim, most likely. And these trade-offs between the images and the words, for instance, between these different sort of mediums, you shouldn't read that as an argument for one or the other, I think, so much as a juxtaposition of these two types of works or whatever, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, running out of steam. I think you probably get the picture. Maybe the new DVD extras from the Criterion will totally change the game here. But I think I'm curious. I'm curious to know what people will say. But I think a lot of people will find watching this movie a bit of a chore. There are definitely nice things about the movie. If you're a big Godard fan, you'll find things to like. But it also reads a little bit like Godard doing an impression of himself, and you're probably better off just watching the real Godard. I don't know. I said that in some ways the Blu-ray release is a little sad. That might be too strong a word. The reason is not because I don't like the movie very much. That doesn't really harm anybody. The reason why I'm not looking forward to it, I guess, is because I think in some ways the movie is more charming if it's a little bit lost. I like the idea of this movie about resurrecting a classic being totally obscure, being accessible through a couple of like random uploads on YouTube that look really bad. Like I said, I think it's charming. In a few weeks, we'll have to settle for the film being merely very obscure rather than totally obscure. If you've seen this movie and survived to this point, I'm genuinely curious about what you thought of it. Maybe I was too sleepy. For this one, finally, I want to give a shout out to Wikipedia editor Minor Prophet. This movie has a long Wikipedia page, much longer than you would expect for this film. Maybe it needs a little bit of polish here and there, but I can tell it was a labor of love for somebody to put that together, and I really admire this. Next week, I think we're going to watch a movie that doesn't have a Wikipedia page at all, at least not of today. We'll see if one emerges before then.